You have already seen the title on the thumbnail, and I know what you are thinking. If Constantinople hadn't fallen in 1453, it would have fallen the next year. Perhaps you are right, but it would make the video quite boring, as nothing would change on a global scale. Here is your realistic answer. This video is not about how the Byzantine Empire would have survived. I would call it something else. It is about how the Ottomans failed to capture the city in 1453, but Constantinople fell nonetheless, in an alternative way. What could have happened if the Byzantine Empire had endured during the siege of Constantinople in 1453, when the Ottoman Empire decided to retreat and try again in 10 years? Perhaps at this time, other countries could join a potential crusade against the Ottoman Empire if it threatened Byzantium again. Such an alternative crusade could have been a huge success, potentially halting the Ottoman Empire's growth in Europe and perhaps completely expelling them, significantly altering world history. But how could Byzantium hold Constantinople during the siege of 1453? The Byzantine Empire was slowly declining, left with only a few provinces in Peloponnese and Constantinople. Although the numbers are disputed, around 10,000 soldiers defended Constantinople, mostly Byzantines, but also Italian volunteers, and, unexpectedly, 600 Turks, loyal to Orhan. As for the Ottoman Empire, they had between 60 to 80,000 soldiers, meaning the defenders were at least 6 times fewer, making the task for Byzantium very difficult. I believe that winning under such conditions would be almost impossible without allies. Changing history up to this moment could have greatly helped. I think Byzantium would have had a chance to survive during the siege if Venice and Genoa had provided the Byzantines with much more assistance than in reality. This may seem contradictory, as these states were rivals of Byzantium, and we all know that after the fall of Constantinople, Genoa, and especially Venice, suffered greatly. First of all, their trade was affected as the Ottoman Empire established control over the Black Sea, where Genoa controlled small parts of Crimea known as Genoese Gazaria. Venice, on the other hand, fought 7 major wars against the Ottoman Empire, winning only 1, so it would have greatly benefited if it had stopped the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople before it was too late. Venice and Genoa were maritime powers, and despite their rivalry, if they had joined forces, Constantinople could have been saved in 1453. It may seem unlikely, but I would say that Venice and Byzantium were rivals, waging many wars against each other. In fact, I was in Venice a couple of weeks ago and took this photo near St. Mark's Square. You know that in the lower left corner stands a bronze statue that was stolen from Constantinople in the year 1204, when the Fourth Crusade failed and destroyed the city. The formation of the Latin Empire had a profoundly negative impact on the Byzantine Empire, and it can be said that it was a true miracle that it managed to survive for another 250 years. I admit that Venice and Byzantium were rivals, but the Venetians preferred to support Byzantium, as they preferred dealing with an enemy rather than an empire they did not know well. Thus, Venice supported Byzantium to prevent the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, and this also allowed Venice to seize more Byzantine territories. However, the cooperation between Venice and Genoa in supporting Byzantium would become impossible in 1453, as they were occupied with wars at home and were on opposite sides. If these wars had ended 2 years earlier, which does not seem impossible, Venice and Genoa could have effectively helped Byzantium. This would have been the only chance for the Byzantines to survive. Of course, this situation is extremely unlikely. Look at the size of the Ottoman Empire compared to Byzantium, which had been in decline for over 3 centuries. Given this, I believe that Venice and Genoa would officially enter into war on behalf of Byzantium against the Ottoman Empire, using their fleets to protect the Byzantine capital. If Byzantium and its allies could achieve naval superiority, they could prevent the Ottoman Empire from accessing the Balkan Peninsula and successfully besiege Constantinople. For the invasion, naval and ground superiority is necessary. That is why these trading republics could be much more useful than, say, Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, which could only attack from land, but not from the sea. The coalition could achieve a decisive victory in the Battle of Gallipoli and ensure naval superiority throughout the war, allowing for the supply of new troops, medicines, and food to Constantinople, making the siege of Constantinople in 1453 unsuccessful. Historically, the Ottoman Empire suffered about 10,000 losses on the first day of the siege, which accounted for approximately 16% of their total forces in the Balkans. This time, the Ottomans would not be able to send new troops to the Balkan front due to the naval blockade, which would jeopardize all their achievements over the last 100 years. The throne claimant Orhan Salibi was sent to Constantinople as a hostage by the Ottomans and even paid tribute to the Byzantines for his upkeep, as he could gather an army and challenge Mahmud, possibly starting a civil war in the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, I previously mentioned that he and 600 other Ottoman deserters participated in the defense of Constantinople. If Orhan somehow left the city and headed to the Ottoman capital, he could have sparked a civil war in the Ottoman Empire, significantly weakening its resources in the Balkans. I also see that Wallachia could join this war, as it was led by Vlad Tepes, also known as Vlad Dracula. The acquisition of the Black Sea coast will threaten the future of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, which could lead to a peace treaty recognizing its defeat. In this agreement, it is likely that Venice will regain Hippus, which will significantly complicate future Ottoman invasions. Venice, as a significant participant, will be granted lands around Varna. This is symbolic, as the crusade to Varna, which took place 9 years ago, failed, and now the Venetians can take pride in their achieved goal. Moreover, south of Varna lies a large lake, making this territory easily defensible. The Venetians, being masters of the sea, will supply Varna by sea, even in the event of an Ottoman siege, using the same strategy that previously saved Constantinople from falling. This victory becomes important for all of Europe, as the position of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans becomes vulnerable. This defeat will push the Ottoman Empire back at least 100 years, which is of great significance. Historically, after the fall of Constantinople, Europeans were shocked by its loss, as the city had been under Roman control for over 1,000 years. Nevertheless, the Europeans did not decide to launch a crusade to restore the Byzantine Empire. Pope Nicholas V wanted to organize a crusade to reclaim the city, as the schism between the Eastern and Western churches was gradually resolving, and the unification of the churches was becoming possible. A more important reason for the crusade was the desire to stop the expansion of the Ottoman Empire in Europe and to free Christians under Ottoman rule. However, all major European powers were occupied with other matters, and few responded to the Pope's call. France and Britain waged the 100 Years' War, which officially ended in October 1453, while Constantinople fell in May of the same year. This means that if the capture of Constantinople had happened just a year later, France and Britain might have been able to allocate forces to participate in the crusade. As for the other Christian states of Europe, they also did not respond to the Pope's call, as Portugal and Spain were planning their own crusade on the Iberian Peninsula against the Muslims, while the Holy Roman Empire was preoccupied with internal affairs and was sufficiently decentralized, making it extremely difficult to gather all the states to participate in the crusade. After the fall of Constantinople, the Holy Roman Empire also became the true successor of the Roman Empire, and therefore, it was not in their interest to assist in the restoration of Constantinople. Unlike the game Europa Universalis de Foi, the Byzantines could not simply unite the churches and convert to Catholicism to attract more countries to their crusade. Bridging the schism between the Eastern and Western churches would indeed become possible. The benefit of this event would certainly have existed, but after the year 1453, it was already too late. The only major Christian European powers that could participate in a possible crusade were Hungary, Poland, and Lithuania. The problem was that these countries tried to organize a crusade just 9 years ago, in 1444, and it ended in a brutal defeat. Although it was not a catastrophe from a military point of view, Poland and Hungary lost their king, Władysław III, which shattered the personal union between the two states. This was also a serious blow to both countries, so they would hardly want to participate in a crusade just 9 years after this terrible event. Thus, I assert that if Constantinople could have held out for about 10 more years before falling, perhaps France and Britain would have decided to join the crusade with small forces, and the memory of the previous campaign in Varna would have been forgotten by Poland and Hungary, which would also encourage their participation. I speak of 10 years, as the Ottoman Empire will undoubtedly try to conquer Constantinople again. But it may take another 10 years for preparation, and they might attempt again in 1463, after their failure in 1453. If this were to happen, and Byzantium was under threat, the Pope could call for a new crusade in support against the Ottoman Empire. All these countries, as I mentioned, would participate in the future crusade against the Ottomans. In retrospect, we know it would have been a good idea, as the Ottoman Empire was on the rise and nearly conquered Vienna. Even if I am mistaken about how Byzantium could have survived during the siege of 1453, these coalitions would not have changed. So if the Byzantines could have held the city on their own, by the time the Ottomans tried again, Europeans would likely organize a crusade against them. The Ottomans chose the perfect moment to attack Constantinople, immediately after the unsuccessful campaign in Varna in 1444, as Mehmed II knew he could safely annex Constantinople since the Europeans were too busy with internal affairs and wars among themselves. An alternative option for the survival of Constantinople could have been the transfer of control over the city to Venice, which would have led to involvement in the war. This is extremely unlikely, as the Byzantine Empire would have little left in that case, having to give up its capital and arguably the most important city in the world. This idea may seem crazy, but that's how it happened to Trebizond in June 1420. The Ottomans invaded it, and in September 1423, the Byzantines handed the city to Venice, leading them into war. If Venice had won this war, they could have saved the city. But that did not happen, and the Ottomans captured Trebizond. This is just one interesting, albeit unlikely scenario. Nevertheless, if Constantinople had survived, the Byzantine Empire could have continued to exist. But this is far from the end of the video. I said this video is not about the survival of Byzantium, as the country found itself in serious trouble. All resources were directed against Constantinople and Byzantium, and soon Byzantium risked bankruptcy after the war, possibly even selling its assets to Venice. The Venetians took pride in their victory, as they managed to halt the spread of Islam in Europe. However, for Byzantium, the situation was not so bright. They had become only a shadow of their former glory, and many in Europe began to doubt whether it was worth keeping them as allies. Even if they sell their assets in Venice, Byzantium will remain significantly weakened, and if a new siege of Constantinople were to begin, the Ottomans would certainly prevail. Some even believed that Byzantium was more of a burden than a benefit. In this situation, one can imagine an interesting scenario where Venice could seize Constantinople by force, ultimately putting an end to the Byzantine Empire, supported by the Pope and his allies, for two main reasons. Firstly, as already mentioned, Byzantium could no longer defend itself, and considering the importance of Constantinople, Europeans would strive for it to be occupied by a stronger Christian country, capable of resisting the Ottomans and halting the spread of Islam. Of course, many would wish to take control of Constantinople, but Venice would be the most logical choice. They had already established an effective alliance with the Pope and were the only ones to respond to the call for a crusade. Of the two options, Venice was undoubtedly stronger and had more territories near the city than Genoa. Secondly, Venice could obtain the Pope's blessing to capture Constantinople, as they were Catholics. Dad would be happy to end the split between East and West, and it was believed that the capture of Constantinople by a Catholic country would bring the Orthodox world back under the authority of the papacy. Thus, Venice could be useful in this regard. Of course, we understand that reality could have been different. Historically, other states, such as Moscow, would likely have declared themselves defenders of the Orthodox world, claiming that Moscow is the third Rome. However, we have the opportunity to view events from a historical perspective. Moreover, Venice could have prevented the capture of Constantinople by the Islamic Ottoman Empire. By absorbing Constantinople, Venice could not only end the schism between East and West, but also halt the spread of Islam, which would benefit the Pope. Therefore, I can imagine that my father would agree to the expansion of Venice's influence, which would cause discontent among many European countries. Although for Venetians like me, this would be good news. Historically, the League of Cambrai was formed, comprising many countries united to weaken Venetian influence in Italy. This alliance initially succeeded. Soon the tides changed, and Venice found itself on top. The problem is that after the capture of Constantinople, many neighboring countries will want to diminish its influence with the Pope's support. I see the Holy League, including all these countries, to stand against Venice and its allies in this war. This means that although Venice will expand, it will be able to do so with the support of the Pope and powerful allies. Historically, France and Spain sought to dominate the Italian states, but this alliance may prevent it from 1497 to 1499. However, for Venice, everything will turn out horribly, as Vasco da Gama's journey opened a new sea route to India, which destroyed the Venetian monopoly. An important source of income will disappear for the Venetians, and trading ships will complicate the task of establishing their own colonies. Thus, Venice must either take an historically incorrect step and establish colonies beyond the Mediterranean, or use its skills of pressure on the Balkans and expand its influence there. To replenish its deficit, Venice may possibly invade other countries and make them vassal states. One of these states could be Albania, which had close ties with Venice due to the protection provided by the Venetians to Albania from foreign invaders in 1459.